They thought their strategy was flawless, drawn up in secrecy with the arrogance of someone convinced they had already won. Every move they made was rehearsed, every step calculated to trap you in their design. They built layers of manipulation, believing you would be too distracted to notice the cracks. Yet all the while, you were silent, patient, carrying your own weapon they had not accounted for. The card they feared was never rage, never revenge, never the chaos they anticipated. The card they feared was your ability to see through the illusion, to dismantle their script with a single choice. When you finally played it, their calculation turned into panic, because the one variable they never considered was the strength of your awareness. You understand something they never will. Calculation without wisdom collapses. They thought they could bend outcomes with force, but their force was predictable. They relied on guilt, so you stopped apologizing. They relied on silence, so you stopped chasing. They relied on charm, so you stopped listening. Each move they planned became useless the moment you played the card of indifference. That was the fear they buried deep, that one day you would stop needing them. And when you did, every trick they had rehearsed turned into smoke. Their calculations never accounted for someone walking away with composure, someone too sharp to be lured back into the same old cycle. Psychology makes the game clear. The manipulator lives by projection. They assume you will react like they would. If they would beg, they expect you to beg. If they would lash out, they expect you to lash out. Their calculations are only reflections of their own fears and desires. You broke them because you did not react according to their design. You played a different rhythm, a different psychology, one they had never studied. That unpredictability shattered their illusion of control. They were prepared for everything except stillness, everything except the decision to detach without spectacle. That was the card they feared. Your refusal to validate the story they created. The card you played was not loud, but it was lethal. It was the quiet recognition that you did not need to fight to win. They expected conflict, they expected defense, they expected you to drown in explanations. Instead, you gave them nothing. That nothingness was the weapon that cut deepest. When you deny a manipulator reaction, you deny them oxygen. They cannot survive long in that suffocation. Their calculation required your cooperation, and you stripped it away. The brilliance of your move was its simplicity. You chose yourself. You closed the door without warning, and their entire plan turned into ashes. They panicked not because you were violent, but because you were unshakable. The moment of collapse is always quiet. They stare at you with disbelief, wondering how you could turn so quickly, how you could slip from their control without noise. What they do not grasp is that it was never sudden. You had been preparing in silence while they plotted in arrogance. They never saw the moment you stopped caring. They never noticed when your patience turned into detachment. Their calculations blinded them, and your silence sharpened you. When you finally played the card, it was not the beginning of your strength. It was the unveiling of what you had been carrying all along. That revelation broke them more than any confrontation could. They depended on patterns. They built their strategy on your past reactions. They knew how to trigger guilt, how to provoke tears, how to spark doubt. But what happens when the pattern ends? What happens when the pawn they expected to move a certain way chooses another direction? Their entire calculation implodes. This is what they feared, that one day you would no longer dance to their rhythm. That is the card you played. You broke the pattern, and once a manipulator loses the rhythm, they lose the board. They cannot improvise. They cannot create new moves. They can only recycle the old ones, and you no longer respond to them. That is the true end of their power. The lesson is sharp. You do not defeat manipulation by matching it. You defeat it by removing the stage it thrives on. You walked away from the argument. You refused the guilt. You silenced the lies by no longer engaging with them. That was the card that scared them most. Because for all their calculation, their empire was fragile. It was built on the assumption that you would always play along. You stopped playing. Their kingdom collapsed without you lifting a sword. That is why they call you dangerous. You won not through rage, but through restraint. Not through attack, but through refusal. The card they feared was your liberation. What they never considered is that you were learning while they were plotting. They thought the game was one-sided, but you were studying every move. You learned how they turned silence into punishment, so you turned silence into power. You learned how they used charm to distract, so you stopped being swayed by sweetness. You learned how they leaned on arrogance, so you let that arrogance expose them. Every observation became a weapon, and when the moment came, you played the card they could never counter. You played the knowledge that you did not need them, and in doing so, you made their entire calculation worthless. They will never admit the truth, but you saw it in their eyes. The fear of losing control. It was not your words that shook them, but the fact that you had been holding the card all along. Their panic was not about losing you. It was about realizing they never truly owned you. They mistook your patience for submission, your silence for blindness, your tolerance for weakness. They never understood that you were simply waiting for the right time to move. When you finally did, the game ended. The arrogance they carried shattered, and the power they thought was permanent slipped through their hands. Patience terrifies because it is silent and unshakable. When they insult you, they expect your anger. When they betray you, they expect your collapse. When they lie, they expect your desperate chase for clarity. But when you remain still, when you withhold the reaction they crave, you strip them of their power. Patience is the refusal to move on their command. It unsettles them because it shows you are no longer controlled by impulse. They cannot read you. They cannot manipulate you. They cannot provoke you. They sit in their own chaos, while you wait in silence that grows heavier by the second. That is the power of patience. It is not absence of action. It is action delayed, sharpened, and calculated to strike when they least expect. Patience dismantles arrogance. They may think they are winning when you stay quiet, when you do not respond, when you let them dance in their illusion of control. But that is their blindness speaking. You are collecting every detail, memorizing every contradiction, and cataloging every slip they think you missed. Patience is observation. You let them believe they are clever, but you are learning them better than they know themselves. By the time you move, you are not reacting, you are exposing. Their confidence shatters not because you shouted, but because your silence lasted longer than their tricks. What terrifies them most is realizing you were always watching, always waiting, never distracted. Their power depended on speed, but your patience made speed irrelevant. The psychological weight of patience is unbearable for manipulators. They are addicted to reaction. Without it, their schemes lose meaning. When you stay calm, they panic because their control was built on making you impulsive. They push harder, they speak louder, they try every weapon they have. Yet you remain steady, unshaken, allowing them to reveal desperation in their attempts. The longer you wait, the more sloppy they become. Their arrogance turns into overreach, their lies turn into contradictions, their silence turns into exposure. Patience is the quiet trap that lures them into destroying themselves. You do not have to chase revenge. Their own panic ensures they collapse on their own. Patience is terrifying because it feels endless. They never know when you will move, and that uncertainty devours them. A loud attack can be defended, a chaotic outburst can be dismissed, but patience is unpredictable. You may strike today, tomorrow, or never. The unknown timing keeps them sleepless. They replay every word, every move, wondering what you saw, what you know, and what you are waiting for. That paranoia is your power. They thought you were vulnerable in your silence, but your silence was a blade pressed against their throat, hidden in plain sight. They fear you not for what you said, but for what you chose not to say. Restraint unsettles the guilty more than any threat could. Patience breaks cycles. Toxic people rely on repetition. They insult, you defend, they lie, you argue, they leave, you chase. Patience interrupts that rhythm. You do not answer the insult, you do not engage the lie, you do not chase the exit. You let the cycle starve, and without fuel, it dies. That is what makes patience so powerful. It does not fight chaos, it refuses to feed it. They try to drag you into their storm, but your stillness forces them to stand alone in it. And standing alone in chaos reveals who they truly are. Their desperation becomes obvious, their control looks fake, their pride crumbles. Patience exposes them more brutally than confrontation ever could. There is an elegance in patience that frightens the arrogant. While they rush to prove themselves, you let silence work in your favor. While they scramble to control, you let time uncover their weakness. While they pretend to be unshakable, you reveal their cracks by simply not moving. The patient one always wins because time is their ally. You let the days, weeks, or months peel away masks that would otherwise stay hidden. They are terrified because they know time is honest, and you are willing to wait for it to tell the truth. That waiting makes you untouchable. They cannot pull you into their speed, and they cannot survive in your stillness. Patience requires strength most people do not have, to wait without breaking, to endure without reacting, to stay silent when provoked. This is power disguised as passivity. It is not easy. It burns inside to hold back, to let them believe they are winning, to let them perform their illusion. But this restraint builds a discipline sharper than any weapon. It turns you into someone who moves with precision, not impulse. They do not understand how you stayed calm while they did everything to rattle you. That misunderstanding is what leaves them afraid. They realize you are operating on a different level. You are not rushing to win moments. You are prepared to win the war. Patience also protects your dignity. Reaction often leads to regret. In anger, you say too much. In desperation, you give too much. In pain, you reveal too much. Patience denies them that satisfaction. You never give them evidence to use against you. Never give them chaos to justify their behavior. Never give them the victory of seeing you broken. Your silence keeps your dignity intact, and that dignity is your crown. They cannot steal it because you never hand it over. This terrifies them because manipulators thrive on humiliation, and you denied them that victory with your restraint. Patience, in this way, becomes a weapon that protects and attacks at the same time. They wanted a quick reaction because quick reactions are easy to manipulate. You refused to give it. You held back long enough to see the bigger picture. That is what sets you apart. You did not play their small game. You waited for the moment where the entire board revealed itself. By then, their pieces were already collapsing, their arrogance already exposed, their power already gone. Patience gave you control of timing, and timing is everything. A sword swung too early misses. A sword swung too late fails. Patience ensures your strike lands perfectly, not out of emotion, but out of clarity. That perfection is what terrifies them. It shows you are not controlled by impulse, but guided by mastery. Every scheme, no matter how polished or carefully woven, carries within it a single weakness: arrogance. They design their plots with precision, convinced that every detail is invisible, every move beyond suspicion. They wear pride like armor, blind to the cracks forming beneath it. Their arrogance convinces them you are too distracted, too naive, too trusting to notice the patterns. Yet arrogance always leaves fingerprints. It makes them sloppy, repeating tactics that once worked, assuming repetition means mastery. You see the flaw because arrogance cannot help but reveal itself. In their smirk, in their overconfidence, in their belief that you will never catch up, the flaw screams louder than the scheme itself. That is when you realize they were never untouchable, they were predictable. Arrogance makes them underestimate silence. They think if you are not shouting, you are not watching. They believe if you are not reacting, you are not thinking. They never imagine that silence can be sharper than confrontation. While they carry themselves with swagger, you are cataloging their steps, memorizing their weaknesses. Their arrogance blinds them to your patience because they cannot comprehend a strength they do not possess. They believe control belongs to whoever is loudest, when in truth, control belongs to whoever is still enough to see. And by the time they realize your silence was calculation, their scheme has already unraveled. The flaw they buried in arrogance is the same flaw that hands you their downfall. Arrogance always overreaches. It does not stop at victory. It demands domination. That hunger for more makes them expose themselves. They cannot win quietly. They need recognition. They cannot succeed in shadows. They need to boast. They cannot lie without smirking at their own cleverness. You see it every time they go too far. What could have stayed hidden gets dragged into the open by their pride. They want you to admire their brilliance, even when they are working against you. That is why you always find the flaw. Their arrogance pushes them past subtlety, past safety, into recklessness. They call it boldness. You call it desperation leaking through disguise. Their downfall is inevitable because they do not know how to stop once they taste control. Every scheme looks sharp on the surface, but arrogance dulls the blade. It convinces them no one else is paying attention, so they grow careless. They use the same lies, forgetting you remember. They use the same tactics, forgetting you endured them before. They repeat themselves because arrogance tells them you are too weak to notice. But you noticed everything. You saw the recycled performance, the familiar script, the same tricks wrapped in new words. They think their schemes are fresh, when in truth, they are predictable reruns. Arrogance blinds them to how exposed they truly are. You already know the ending because arrogance is a flaw that repeats like a drumbeat. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Arrogance convinces them that fear will silence you. They believe intimidation will keep you obedient, guilt will keep you small, and manipulation will keep you tangled. But arrogance never accounts for resilience. They never consider what happens when you stop fearing the collapse, when you stop needing their approval, when you stop reacting to their control. That is when the flaw begins to split wide open. They panic because their entire scheme depended on your blindness. Without your compliance, their empire crumbles. Arrogance told them you were too dependent to leave. They were wrong. You left, and suddenly their strategy revealed itself as nothing more than noise. Their flaw destroyed them, not your attack. The psychology of arrogance is simple. It thrives on illusion. They convince themselves they are smarter, stronger, more capable than they truly are. That illusion comforts them but betrays them. Arrogance makes them ignore details that matter, overlook signals that warn, and underestimate the quiet intelligence of the one they target. You became their blind spot because arrogance told them you were not a threat. They miscalculated not because they lacked intelligence, but because they drowned in their own pride. That pride is poison. It clouds judgment, distorts reality, and magnifies mistakes. They do not even notice when they trip over their own schemes. You notice, because arrogance is always louder than the lie it hides behind. Arrogance forces them to play to the audience. They do not scheme for survival, they scheme for validation. They want to feel brilliant, to feel untouchable, to feel like masterminds. That desire is what makes them reckless. A true mastermind hides forever. The arrogant manipulator always reveals themselves eventually. They cannot resist dropping hints, mocking you with smirks, leaving trails of their supposed genius. And you, watching quietly, see those hints as confessions. What they thought was intimidation becomes evidence. What they thought was clever becomes sloppy. Their arrogance makes them desperate to be seen, and that desperation always ruins the scheme. They cannot hide from the flaw because they are addicted to showcasing it. Every empire of manipulation collapses for the same reason. Pride devours itself. Arrogance is greedy. It is not satisfied with winning, it needs to humiliate. It is not satisfied with survival, it needs control. And in that hunger, it destroys its own design. You saw the collapse coming because you recognized that hunger. You knew they would go too far, push too hard, expose too much. The flaw was not in the strategy, it was in the one who carried it. Arrogance hollowed them from within, and the hollow cannot stand against observation. They thought you were their victim, when you were simply their witness. Their arrogance handed you the ending. What terrifies them is realizing you saw the flaw before they did. You never shouted about it. You never warned them. You let them build, let them boast, let them believe. Then when the time came, you stepped aside and let the weight of their own arrogance crush them. That is why they panic in your silence. They wonder how much you know, how long you've been watching, how many flaws you already mapped. Their arrogance told them they were hidden. Your patience revealed they were exposed. That realization leaves them broken, because it shows the flaw was never external. It lived inside them all along. They believed leverage was eternal, that the hooks they planted in your skin would always keep you tied. They fed off your fear of abandonment, your hunger for validation, your longing for fairness. Those became their weapons. They did not need strength. They only needed you to keep handing them reasons to control you. But when you began stripping away those hooks, one by one, the game changed. You stopped fearing their silence. You stopped craving their approval. You stopped demanding explanations from mouths that only carried lies. That was the moment leverage turned into dust. They felt the shift immediately, even if you said nothing, because leverage only works when you carry it for them. The second you dropped it, they had nothing left. Leverage is always disguised as intimacy. They get close enough to study you, to memorize your weak points, to discover what you crave most. Then they turn those discoveries into shackles. They use your guilt to keep you apologizing, your love to keep you forgiving, your dreams to keep you compromising. But here is the flaw. Leverage is not power on its own. It is borrowed. It exists only if you agree to hold it. The moment you decide your peace is more important than their approval, their grip weakens. The moment you decide your silence is more valuable than their arguments, their voice shrinks. You beat them not by overpowering, but by unplugging. The chain breaks when you stop pulling. The fear of loss is the oldest leverage. They dangle connection like a prize. They disappear to punish, return to control, and threaten absence to keep you chained. It works only as long as you fear being alone. When you finally understand that solitude is better than poisoned company, the illusion shatters. They cannot control you by walking away if you are willing to let the door close. They cannot manipulate with silence if your spirit thrives without their noise. They cannot weaponize rejection if you no longer crave their seat at your table. That is why self-respect is lethal. It cuts their leverage at the root. You become immune to their vanishing act, and their tricks turn into pathetic echoes of power they no longer hold. Another form of leverage is guilt. They know you want to be seen as good, so they twist it. They act wounded when confronted, they cry when cornered, they flip blame until you carry the weight for them. That guilt was their leash. But guilt only works if you still need them to absolve you. The moment you stop trying to prove your worth to someone unworthy of it, the leash snaps. Their accusations sound empty, their dramatics look rehearsed, their tears no longer move you. That silence you give in response is the strike they never prepared for. You did not beat them with fury. You beat them with the removal of guilt's leverage. They were relying on your conscience, and you finally refused to rent it out to them. Leverage thrives on insecurity. They study what you doubt about yourself and mirror it back as control. They say you will never find better, and you stay. They say you are too broken to survive without them, and you cling. They say your dreams are impossible, and you believe. That is how leverage works. It weaponizes the weakness you have not yet healed. But the second you choose to heal, to build, to grow sharper, the weapon dulls. They cannot control you with scarcity when you create abundance. They cannot bind you with doubt when you anchor in clarity. They cannot convince you of smallness when you live with proof of your magnitude. The removal of insecurity is the removal of their leverage, and without it, their voice shrinks into irrelevance. Psychology explains the trap. They build dependency, then exploit it. They want you tied to their approval, their resources, their validation. They want you to need them more than they need you. That imbalance is the foundation of their leverage. But dependency dies the moment you realize you can survive without them. Independence is not just survival, it is rebellion. When you refuse to depend, you refuse to be manipulated. Their calculation falls apart because their greatest weapon was your willingness to believe you were powerless without them. You are not. You never were. You simply had to see that every need they exploited can be built within yourself. That realization is the card that flips the entire table. Leverage has no strength without reaction. They guilt, you defend. They insult, you argue. They withdraw, you chase. Every reaction is fuel. They planned for you to play your role in the cycle. When you stopped reacting, you stripped away their stage. They shouted into silence, and the silence burned them alive. They pushed buttons, and the machine no longer moved. That is when panic set in. They cannot exist without reaction, because leverage does not live in isolation. It lives in your willingness to respond. You won the game not by louder words, but by no words at all. They leaned on the leverage of your reaction, and you cut the cord. What unsettles them most is how simple the shift was.